This week, the Torah extols the virtues of Abraham and his son Yitzchak. This is the episode called the Akedah, the binding of Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. And it's the ultimate test of our father, our patriarch Abraham. And yet, the Torah, or the oral law, despite the fact that we extol the virtues of Yitzchak throughout the Talmud, nonetheless, this is not considered a test for Yitzchak. How could this be? It's a test for Abraham, but not a test for Yitzchak. And yet, in terms of virtue, in terms of the self-sacrifice, Yitzchak is used as the example, as the paradigm for self-sacrifice. What am I trying to drive at? In the world, there are different words used for people who die for their beliefs, or willing to die for their beliefs. And there were many people who died for their beliefs in the ancient world, people who had certain principles of faith, were willing to forego their lives rather than dishonor themselves, rather than go against their standard of behavior. Why is Yitzchak singled out when there were many people in the ancient world who were willing to die for their principles? I once introduced the Senate with a prayer, and I was allowed to remain in the chambers of the Senate for a while, as long as I wanted. Tell the truth, there was only 2 or 3 senators there for my prayer. But after my prayer, Senator Robert Byrd began to speak to the television and gave a lecture. I don't know to whom and which channels carried it, but he gave a lecture on the virtues of people who stood up for their oath and were willing to sacrifice their lives because they gave their sacred honor in an oath and they refused to violate their oath, even at the pain of death. He told the story of a Carthaginian who was sworn by the Romans to come back after he came to negotiate with the people of Carthage. And of course, he indicated to the people of Carthage that the terms of the Romans were not to be accepted, but he had to go back because he had given them his word, his sacred honor. They pleaded with him that they would protect him, and he refused. Because since he had taken an oath, that oath was sacrosanct, and he had to fulfill it despite that it would lead to his death. So there were people in the ancient world who stood for something. Why is Isaac held in such high esteem? The same is also in the discussion of modern day politics. There are many who commit suicide as acts of faith. The most prevalent, of course, are the Islamic terrorists who commit suicide and kill many others. We consider them terrorists. Their brethren consider them Shahids, holy martyrs. And it is this idea that a holy martyr is honored while he kills others that I wish to address. In our prayers, Jewish prayers, we have many different poems. The poems often go back to characters that are found in the Bible. And we ask God to forgive us, or God to remember us, or God to have compassion upon us because of the acts of those individuals. And we mention he who intervened on behalf of Isaac, or he listened and intervened on behalf of Abraham, should answer us. But there was a great man who asked God to give him strength to take revenge upon his enemies. Remember me, O God, and let me take vengeance upon my enemies. That, of course, was Samson. And Samson lost his strength because he divulged the source of his strength, which was his hair. The hair was cut off and he had no more power. He had power, but nothing like the power that he had before. And he was in chains, and he was mocked by the people of the Philistines. And he put his hands between two pillars and asked God for one more surge of power. And he moved those pillars, and the roof came crashing down upon himself and 3,000 Philistines. And he killed more Philistines, more enemies of his people, at the time of his death than he did in his entire lifetime. He prayed that he be given that strength. And yet, we don't mention his actions, his martyrdom. We don't mention that God answered his prayer at that moment and allowed him to take vengeance upon those who hurt him, who took his eyes out, who brutalized him, and he killed them while he died himself. We don't mention Samson as a Shahid, as a martyr, as someone who God answered. We mention Daniel in the lion's den. We mention Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah in the fiery furnace. We mention Aaron with the fire pan. We mention Moshe Rabbeinu at the time of the golden calf. But we don't mention the acts of violence that must have had God's hand in it. We don't mention King David killing Goliath, the one who answered David when he met Goliath should answer us. We don't say that. Because it's not true martyrdom. What represents true martyrdom? So what is the introduction of that section, the last section of the reading of the Torah of this week? What introduces this episode? So I will tell you. It says that Abraham vayita Eshel Bever Sheva, and Abraham planted an Eshel. Some say Eshel was an orchard where he grew fruits, beautiful fruits in a desert setting. People could have benefit from there. But the simple meaning of Vayita Eshel means he put a place where people could stay over in the desert. And people were able to rest there and eat there and stay overnight. The word Eshel, while also being an orchard, is an abbreviation, an acrostic. Aleph, Shin, Lamed. Achila, Shtia, Lina. Achila, eating. Shtia, drinking. Lina is having a night's sleep. He made the first Chabad house. Abraham made a Chabad house. Of course, it was called Abraham's house, not the Chabad house. But you get my drift. It's a place where any Jew who needs, or any person who needs some assistance, was able to find it in Abraham's Eshel. Why is this important as an introduction to the story of Isaac? I met many people, interesting, fascinating people in Israel. And some of them made deep impressions upon me. One of the people who made the most impression upon me was a woman. She was married to a distant relative. Her name was Mrs. Levin, and her children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren are many. She was married to the only surviving son of a storied chassid. Rav Mordechai Omotel Levin was the only surviving son of the famous chassid Rabbi Yisrael Nevler, Rabbi Yisrael Levin, who was the first cousin to my grandmother, but was more like a brother to her. And I was invited by Motel to come by one Thursday night and to see what they do, because they were bright guys that were learning, and I should participate or enjoy what they were doing. So I came one Thursday night. For the most part, I was a young kid. I was a nothing. And they weren't interested in sharing with me. They were interested in their stuff. And so I wound up listening to the stories of Mrs. Levin. Mrs. Levin's father I later met in 770. He was the famous Chassid Reb Avram Driesen, also known as Reb Avram Mayor. They had 9 children in the family. During the war years, they could only afford an apartment that had 2 rooms, kitchen and a bedroom. In the bedroom slept Reb Avram and his Rebbetzin and their 9 children. In the kitchen, there were no beds, there was just floors. But whatever they could do to make comfortable people, they did. And people slept on the floor of the kitchen of the Driesen household. How many were there? Most of the time there were about 10 people there. So 11 people slept in the bedroom, 10 people slept in the kitchen. Who were those 10 people? People who didn't have a place to stay, a place to eat, a place to stay warm. Some of them were running away from the government. And had they been caught, they would have been shot, and Rabbi Avram Driesen would have been shot together with them. Despite that, they were there. And those people who came had to be fed. And quite often, the family had to tighten their belts so that everybody could have something to eat. Sometimes family members had to be in those rooms, in that kitchen, but they had to give up their place for the guests. When you're a place of refuge for other people, you have to give something up. Your comfort, your food, your privacy. It's difficult to be together with other people in a crowded place, sharing space that's so limited. But share they did. And they willingly put their lives on the line for the sake of God and the sake of His Torah. No matter how wealthy you are, there's always a time when there isn't enough for everyone. And I'm sure, in fact, I know that this is the case because the Rebbe pointed that out, that Yitzchak was raised in this environment. And many times Yitzchak had to abandon his comfortable place of sleep so that somebody else could have that place. And sometimes there wasn't enough food. And he had to give up his food, or at least some of his food, or the good portion of his food. Maybe he liked the steak, maybe he liked the polka. He had to give that up because somebody else needed it or wanted it. See, the education of the Chabad house isn't one of martyrdom at the expense of someone else. It's giving up your comfort so that someone else can have theirs. It's the willingness to put yourself aside for a higher cause. What makes a Shahid in Judaism is not someone who murders or kills someone else, even virtuously. Because in killing someone else, there's an element of anger, there's an element of revenge, there's an element could be an element of jealousy, there's an element of frustration. Enmity is a motivation. There's a certain selfishness there. Dying in order to kill your enemy is not totally virtuous. There still exists a certain selfish motivation there. True martyrdom is when you get nothing out of it except the glory of God. You do it because this is what has to be done. And there's no other way to sanctify God's name except by dying. There is no personal glory there. You die. But you do so because this is the ultimate purpose of our creation, is to bring glory to God. To put yourself aside for the greater glory, the greater good. Maybe it's a greater good for mankind. Maybe it's a greater good for the Jewish people, or the greater good of the glory of the Creator. But the way in which we learn to put ourselves aside for a higher purpose is when we put aside our comforts so that someone else can have. We put aside ourselves for a higher purpose to share with another individual. And that is the process. That's the learning process, the learning curve that produces people who are willing to sacrifice their lives for the sake of God. Not a military school where people are willing to sacrifice their lives for the army, for the kingdom, for the king, against our enemies. Those are great people too. But that's not the ultimate. It's not the Shahid, the true martyr. The true martyr is someone who does so only because it's for the higher purpose, the higher, greater glory of God and God's will. And those who sacrifice their lives, we honor, we remember them, and sometimes God intervenes on their behalf. And we ask God to intervene on our behalf, just as He did, as God did for them. But we don't mention Samson, and we don't mention David. We don't even mention the tribe of the Levites, who killed those who worshipped the golden calf. Because this is not the ultimate virtue. We remember those who die, who put their lives on the line and are willing to die for their beliefs. We don't immortalize those who killed for their beliefs. Sometimes you have to do that. But that's not the ultimate. That's not the martyr that we extol.